Okay, so we're talking about the last section of The Monk, and I'm not going to talk about the last few pages specifically in case you haven't finished them yet, and I don't want to spoil them for you. So instead, what I'm going to talk about is what precedes them, obviously, and some of the themes that we've been following recur in slightly different forms in the last section. And the first one I want to talk about, and we've talked about this a little bit, but not enough, is the way in which the book critiques religion. And here it becomes much more explicit. We have Ambrosio absolutely turning into this vile, sinful, despicable criminal. He who was a few weeks before the sort of model of virtue. And we have the prioress, who is this horrible, vindictive person who's locked Agnes in a dungeon. And one of the things that happens fairly early on, I think, is that they tear her to pieces. So once her ways are discovered, she's quite literally savaged, and fires are set to rescue the sisters, the nuns in the convent. And that could just be read as an attack on the corruption of this particular convent and this particular monastery. But it also seems to suggest there's maybe some larger structural issues in this iteration of Catholicism or Orthodoxy that are at the very least too restrictive and at worst actually encouraging cruel and unusual behavior. So she's torn apart. The other thing that happens is in the beginning of this section that there's this parade and the most beautiful woman is put on display. And the most beautiful woman, it says of her, Lorenzo's heart might have been stolen had it not already been given to Antonia. And this foreshadows for us what comes to be true, which is that Lorenzo, so Antonia is murdered by the monk. And Lorenzo is rescued very literally by his life is saved very literally by the ministrations of this woman who's called Virginia, or whom I will call Virgin. Yeah. All right, so she takes the place of the novel's Virgin. This is all in contradistinction to Agnes, who's clearly our whore, but also the one, not that we're not rooting for Antonia, of course, we hate what's happening to her. It's also the case, I think, that we feel more for Agnes. Agnes has been left in this underground dungeon and been fed, sort of. The most horrible part of this book for me is when she's holding her dead baby. And in fact, I can only skim that section because it fills me with such horror. But what happens there structurally is that the fruits of her transgression, the baby, dies. So that we might read as a punishment for her having transgressed the rules of virginity, but specifically the rules of the convent. Okay, so that might be a sort of, I hate to say just, but like natural consequence of her sins, her having failed. Okay, so there's Agnes. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is in chapter 4 of volume 3, is the rape and murder of Antonia. And this is where Antonia is raped by Ambrosio. And as soon as he's raped, not unlike what happened when transports are passed, right? He suddenly feels really differently. And Matilda tries to murder her, and he says, no, stop, and then he murders her. And so now he's raped Antonia, stolen her, communed with the dark forces, murdered Elvira also, and is now suddenly held up for suspicion, and no one can believe it because he, a few weeks ago, had been the model of virtue, but there's a more specific word that I'm trying to think of, like continence, like not giving in to worldly desire. And he blames Matilda for all of this, of course, and she points out that that she told him every step of the way exactly what he was doing, and that it was his own pride that that led him down this path. And then we get Antonia dying in the arms of Lorenzo, and in this beautiful, totally a trope of romance, she's like, I'm happy to die now because I'm defiled and I get to see my mother and I get to see you this one other time also. Death is a blessing. She could not have been his wife because she was defiled, raped by someone else. Okay, that moment there is crucial, because it shows us the difference between Agnes, who has sex out of love, and Antonia, who's raped. And here it's Antonia who's really suffering the punishments of whoredom, even though that whoredom is being raped, which takes us right back to Pamela. Okay, and then I think very lastly, although again, I don't want to get to the end, Agnes is recovered and allowed to be with Raymond. Her punishment is that her baby has died and she lived in a dungeon for a long time, but we're meant to see her as recovered, and that is a happy union. I guess without getting all the way to the end, I can point out that Ambrosio's first moment of weakness is once he sees the beauteous orb, allowing Rosario to remain in the monastery as Matilda. And then as soon as he has sex with her, we get this, it's the die was thrown, right? He's already done it. And at that point, it just seems like he's on some downward spiral and everything seems to follow from what's come before. Eventually, and this is in chapter 5 of volume 3, he says that God cannot pardon him, that his sins have been too great to be pardoned. And I would argue, I am arguing, that that works in conjunction with his with the narrator's declaration, maybe in Free and Direct Discourse, that the die was thrown, that he has done so much that not even God cannot, not even God can forgive all the sins that Ambrosio has committed. And that is actually the moment of pride that would damn Ambrosio, his doubt of God's love, but also this this pride wherein one says, I alone have done all the horrible things that God could not forgive. Other people might have done horrible things, but not like I did, as a sort of moment of pride as well. Okay, I hope that you love hate the last section. I know already that somebody hates it, but we'll talk in class about how, whether there's a way to love hate the end or actually see it as justice enacted. Okay.